My name is Bill Banks. I'm the director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism. It's a real pleasure today to have with us Professor Colin Kahl, who's at the Wall School in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. The topic could not be more timely, and Professor Kahl is indeed an expert. He's engaged in considerable scholarship as well as government service in the area of security studies, in particular concerning the Middle East, and has written an important book published by Princeton in 2006 on state security and civil strife in the developing world. In addition, just before his appointment here at the Walsh School at Georgetown, from 2009 to 2011, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. And in that capacity, of course, provided policy advice to the Secretary on the area, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, among other nations in that region of the world. Professor Kahl worked considerably on the Iraq conflict and post-conflict developments and governance inside Iraq, and for which service he received from the Secretary last year an award for extraordinary public service from Secretary Gates. So please join me in welcoming Colin Kahl.
Well, hi everybody. It's good to be here. It's actually, I went to grad school in New York City at Columbia University, but I've spent very little time upstate, so it's nice to finally see the rest of New York. So as the introduction made clear, I'm an academic by day, but I was a government official from February of 2009 through 2011. One of the reasons I'm here at Syracuse is that I worked very closely with Dean Steinberg, who was the Deputy Secretary of the State Department during the time that I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. He was obviously much higher on the food chain than I was, but we worked very closely on a whole host of issues. The office I ran at the Pentagon was about 40 folks. We were the policy office for the Middle East, and the portfolio stretched, as was mentioned, from Egypt up through Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, over the Gulf to Iran, then down in the Gulf, all the Gulf Cooperation Council states, plus Yemen. So I didn't do Libya, and I didn't do Afghanistan and Pakistan. I just did the easy countries sandwiched in between. My last day on the job was December 15th of last year, and I was sitting on the tarmac at Baghdad International Airport watching the American flag come down over Camp Victory, which was our last major base to be closed in Iraq, and the rest of our troops left that shortly thereafter. I would say for the first 2 years in my job, in 2009, 2010, I spent about 90% of my personal bandwidth on some combination of the three I's. Iraq, because we had 140,000 forces, 500 bases and facilities, 3 million pieces of equipment that we were trying to get out with a modicum of dignity and safety. Israel, because they were our closest ally in the region and we had extraordinary defense relationships with them. And Iran, because if Iraq was last year's war, the fear was that Iran would be next year's war. So I spent an extraordinary amount of my time on Iran. Now, obviously, in 2011, much of our energy was focused on the turbulence created by the Arab Spring. So I spent a lot of time in Egypt and Bahrain and Yemen and Syria and other places. But today, I want to talk to you about Iran, which I think, rightly or wrongly, probably ranks among the top national security challenges and concerns that American policymakers, certainly in Washington, have. And I think if you look at the polls, ranks among the top concerns that Americans, period, have. At the same time, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Iran nuclear issue, and hopefully I won't contribute to that misunderstanding today, but actually give you a slightly more detailed view of what's a pretty complex issue. So the first question to ask is, what the heck is Iran doing? What are they doing in the nuclear arena? Are they building nuclear weapons? Do they solely have a peaceful nuclear program? The answer is somewhere in between. Nuclear proliferation scholars call the strategy that Iran is engaged in nuclear hedging. Right? What that refers to is the Iranians are clearly trying to develop all the capabilities that would enable the regime at some point to make a decision to build nuclear weapons when and if they decide to do so. right? But it doesn't mean they've made that decision yet. And in fact, they may never make that decision. This isn't unique to Iran, by the way. A lot of countries that developed nuclear weapons engaged in a hedging strategy. That is, they developed all the pieces and then didn't make the decision until the very end, right? And some of them crossed the threshold and some of them actually went backwards, right? So there's not an inevitability to this, but there are a lot of things that are concerning about this. You know, Iran was an early signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as a signatory to the NPT, they have an obligation not to develop nuclear weapons, but they also have the right to peaceful nuclear energy. Okay? And a lot of people actually criticize the NPT as allowing a lot of nuclear hedging activity to actually occur. That is, countries to master certain technologies that are relevant for domestic civilian purposes, but are also potentially relevant for nuclear weapons development. So Iran is really pursuing three lines of effort as it relates to their nuclear hedging strategy. The first is, and the one that everybody talks about, is mastering the fuel cycle, and in particular, enriching uranium. So if you want to produce uranium for a nuclear power plant, you enrich uranium-235 up to a purity of 3.5%. Okay? If you want to generate fuel for a medical research reactor like the Iranians have in Tehran, then you may need to enrich up to 20%. But if you want to build a nuclear weapon, you can enrich the same uranium up to 90% or above. All right? So the same activities that can be used to fuel civilian peaceful power plants can also, those same technologies, that same knowledge, can be used to generate the fissile material, all right, to produce the explosive material inside a nuclear warhead. All right? So that's what they're doing up here, the fuel cycle activities, and I'll talk to you about in a minute about how far advanced they are on that. And that's out in the open. All right, we know that they're doing that. They admit to be doing that. In fact, they claim a right to do it under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're also doing a number of missile activities out in the open. Iran has the largest arsenal of ballistic missiles in the Middle East. Probably not the most sophisticated arsenal. Israel probably ranks top in that category, but as it relates to the sheer number of ballistic missiles, Iran is right at the top. They've developed a number of missiles, particularly the Shahab-3 medium-range ballistic missile that can potentially be equipped with a nuclear warhead. That is, its technical specifications would allow it at some point in the future to be modified for use as a nuclear missile. It's not a nuclear missile at the moment. It's a conventional missile. So again, it's not prohibited activity. That stuff they're doing out in the open. It's largely declared. It's not secret. But they've also engaged in a whole host of research and development that could be relevant to designing a nuclear explosive device. So schematics for weapons, various explosive testing, and other things, not nuclear testing, but testing that may be relevant to the conventional explosives that are used to trigger a nuclear chain reaction. And these aren't my views. These are the views of the International Atomic Energy Agency, as well as the judgments of the U.S. intelligence community as declassified in the 2007 NIE. And news reports suggest that the intelligence findings haven't dramatically changed. Those assessments, both the IAEA assessments and the intelligence community assessments, as discussed at least in the media, suggested that Iran had a very structured, organized research and development program on nuclear weapons up until 2003, and then they stopped. All right, they were given a halt order. Now, it doesn't mean that they have stopped all their activities. It just means that they stopped the structured, organized program to do the research and development into a nuclear weapon, and instead have engaged in a number of dual-use activities since then that could be relevant to generating the expertise eventually necessary for building a bomb, but is not structured. At some point, if they make enough progress, they could move from a near threshold capability, which they have now, which is that they could produce a weapon in a couple of years, a year or two. I'll be more specific in a minute. To a threshold or virtual capability, meaning they might be able to produce a complete weapon in a number of days or a couple of weeks. Or they could cross the threshold if the Supreme Leader makes a decision and start to develop a full-fledged nuclear arsenal. All right? But they're not there yet. They're here. All right? But that's the strategy that they're engaged in. So, how much progress are they making? You probably all know who this guy is, Ahmadinejad. He's walking through a facility called Natanz. Natanz is one of the two uranium enrichment facilities that Iran has that we know about. It's by far the largest one. It can hold as many as 50,000 centrifuges. Centrifuges are the big cylindrical machines that you see him walking between. Basically, these things spin really quickly. And as they spin really quickly, they separate uranium into different levels of purity. Okay, so you take the uranium you take the uranium gas, you spin it to a certain degree, and you can get 3.5% uranium. You spin it more, you can get 20%. You spin it more, you can get 60%. You spin it more, you can get 90%. That's a gross oversimplification, but you get the basic point. All right. So I said they had two facilities. One is Natanz. Natanz has a pilot plant that's on the surface, and then it has a deeply buried plant where most of the centrifuges are. And Natanz was a covert facility until it was outed by Western intelligence services in 2002. Right? It was technically outed by the MEK, but most people believe that the MEK, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, which is an Iranian dissident group, which has long been on the U.S. foreign terrorist organization list until just recently, largely believe that organization went public with that information because they got that information from Western intelligence services. But anyway, Natanz was outed in 2002. The second facility they have is a place called Fordo, and it's a much smaller facility. It only holds as many as 3,000 centrifuges. They've installed about 2/3 of those already. And it is deeply buried 200 to 300 feet under rock, soil, and concrete in a mountain near the holy city of Qom. If you can kind of think of one of these James Bond supervillain lair type places, that's what Fordo is. All right. And it's buried much, much more deeply than Natanz, and as a result, much more difficult to destroy from aerial bombardment. And Fordo was also kept secret by the Iranians until it was outed by the Obama administration in September of 2009. Okay? So the very fact that the Iranians build covert enrichment facilities is in and of itself suspicious. And the fact that they built them, in the case of Fordo, on a military base, 200 feet under rock and soil on the side of a mountain, is also somewhat suspicious, let's just say that. What are they doing in these two places? At Natanz, they are enriching at two different levels, okay? They are enriching to the 3.5% level. That's what this graph is. The top graph, these two graphs, by the way, come from the latest International Atomic Energy Agency report that just came out about a month ago. And you can see their stockpile of accumulated, it says up to 5%, but it's really 3.5%. Their stockpile of 3.5% uranium has grown substantially in recent years. Right? Again, 3.5% level of purity is what is required to fuel civilian nuclear power plants. They only have one of these, and it's Bushehr. It's a place called Bushehr, and they actually don't need fuel for it because they get fuel from the Russians. But ostensibly, they argue that in case the Russians don't follow through with giving them fuel, they need fuel from their own sources, and they plan to build a bunch more power plants. So that's their justification for stockpiling 3.5% low enriched uranium, even though technically they don't need it at the moment. The other, and how much of that stuff do they have? They have enough. They have thousands and thousands of kilograms of it. They have enough that if it was enriched from the 3.5% level of purity up to weapons grade level, 90%, they could construct as many as 6 nuclear weapons. All right, so they have a lot of this stuff. I'll talk about how quickly they might be able to do that in a minute. They're also producing enriched uranium at the 20% level, technically 19.75. Why are they doing that? Because they have a research reactor called the Tehran Research Reactor near Tehran that is a medical reactor that produces radioactive isotopes ostensibly to treat cancer patients. And it requires, to make the fuel plates for the Tehran Research Reactor, it requires uranium enriched to the purity of 20%. Right? In 2010, they started to enrich to the 20% level, and they've accumulated enough 20% uranium for about half a bomb, if it were enriched up to 90%. Right. They are enriching at the 20% level both at Natanz and at Fordo. They're enriching at the 3.5% level just at Natanz. They are enriching at the 20% level at both. Right? Why do we care? If Iran made the decision tomorrow, if the Supreme Leader of Iran, who is the decider on issues of, as it relates to the nuclear program, if he made the decision tomorrow to go for a nuclear weapon, they could enrich their stockpile of 3.5% uranium to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a single bomb within about 4 months. Okay, so if they took their stockpile of 3.5% uranium, they took a portion of it, and they started enriching it from 3.5% up to 90%, they could do it in about 4 months. if they get a bomb's worth of 20% low enriched uranium, they could shrink that timeline to about 30 days. Right? Now, why is that? It's because I'm not a physicist, right? But it's basically nonlinear. Doing the work to get from 3.5% up to 20% purity gets you 90% of the way to 90% purity. It's very confusing, but you basically think about it this way. If you have enough of the 20% material lying around, you've done 90% of the work required to generate the fissile material for a nuclear weapon. All right? Now, how many of you saw, or either saw the speech or saw stories of the speech of Benjamin Netanyahu's speech at the UN General Assembly 10 days ago? Right? Remember that Wile E. Coyote cartoon bomb thing that he drew the line on, and it said 90%, right, was his red line for taking military action? It was very confusing to a lot of people, because 90% of what, right? What he was talking about is this 20% issue. He just didn't explain it that way. Basically, what he was saying is his red line, or the red line that he recommended to the international community, was that by the time Iran has completed 90% of the work necessary to generate weapons-grade uranium, that's the time that the international community needs to take military action. So he drew that line, and what that really meant is by the time they accumulate a bomb's worth of 20% uranium. Now you can see how that could be publicly confusing, because a bomb's worth of 20% is equal to 90%, but then 90%, don't worry about that. When he said 6 to 8 months from now, Iran will be approaching his red line, what he meant is that 6 to 8 months from now, they will have accumulated enough 20% low enriched uranium in some combination of Natanz and Fordo to theoretically produce one nuclear weapon, and they can do it as quickly as 30 to 40 days. Now, does that mean they can produce a nuclear weapon in 30 to 40 days? No. It means they can produce the fissile material, all right, the weapons-grade uranium necessary to construct an explosive device within 30 to 40 days. But all of the rest of the weapon, the design of the weapon, the material work that would have to go into it, the research that would go in, would take a lot longer. Right? And in fact, public estimates by intelligence officials and others suggest it would take at least a year for them to produce a crude device. So it might take them, 3-4 months under some scenarios, 1 to 2 months under other scenarios to create the fissile material, but it would take them a year total to create a crude device. Which, by the way, is about the same amount of time it would have taken them for a long. That timing hasn't changed dramatically in recent years. All right. That's the bad news. They're accumulating more of this stuff. They're getting more sophisticated in their ability to enrich it, and they're shrinking their timeline. Right. Here's the good news. None of those timelines kick in until the Supreme Leader of Iran says go. All right. So sometimes when you read a story that says it could take them 4 months to get the fissile material for a bomb, or it could take them a year to get a nuclear weapon, or it could take them 2 or 3 years to get a sophisticated enough weapon to put on the tip of a missile, which is another projection. It might sound like, holy crap, a year from now they're going to have a nuclear weapon. Or 2 years from now they're going to have a nuclear missile. That's not necessarily true. Because that timeline doesn't begin until the Supreme Leader says go. So imagine the Supreme Leader standing at the beginning of, at the starting line in a race, holding a starting pistol. All right? That 1 year timeline is like this, and it moves forward in time until he says go, in which case it goes like that. All right? So if he doesn't make the decision a year from now, he'll still be a year away. If he doesn't make the decision 2 years from now, he'll still be a year away. Right? The concern is that over time, that year that it would take will compress. Right? They'll master more and more of the technology. They'll do more research and development relative to a weapon. So over time, that timeline could shrink. Right? It used to be 18 months, now it's probably 12 months, maybe 2 years from now it'll be 6 months. I mean, it depends on the assumptions that you make. All right? Now, why hasn't the Supreme Leader made this decision? We don't know. Okay. But we have a pretty good guess. To produce weapons-grade uranium, he has to enrich a stockpile of low-enriched uranium up to high-enriched uranium, right? Following along? There are 2 facilities he can do that at, right? Natanz and Fordo. They are both declared facilities, which means they are both under constant IAEA inspection. That is, there are inspectors there every couple of weeks. The stockpile of low-enriched uranium is literally under seal. It's under lock and key. So for them to make the material for a bomb, they would have to divert the stuff that's under seal and then reconfigure their centrifuges and cascades to produce weapons-grade uranium, and then they would have to start doing it, right? And that takes anywhere from between 4 months, if they use the 3.5% level, or potentially sometime next year, it could take them 30 or 40 days. They get caught. They get caught. And if they got caught, they get attacked. And since the Supreme Leader doesn't want to get attacked, he doesn't want to do something that gets him caught. So he's deterred at the moment from making this decision. First of all, we don't know whether he's ever going to make this decision. But if he was inclined to make the decision, he's deterred to do so at the moment because he's afraid of getting caught. So the question then becomes, for the international community, at what point could he shrink their time to a bomb so small that he won't fear getting caught? Or that if he fears he got caught, he thinks he could get away with it before the international community could do something about it. Right? Prime Minister Netanyahu thinks that point kicks in next spring. Right? I don't think the American perspective is the same on that. Right? Or the Supreme Leader might do it if he decides that he could do it completely in secret. That is, that there's some parallel enrichment program that isn't Fordo or Natanz, it's somewhere else. In fact, some of my friends to the right of where I am politically sometimes say, well, Colin, how do you know that they don't have a bunch of covert facilities that we don't know about? We got to take military action now. In which case they say, well, if you don't know where the facilities are, you can't attack them. Right? And bombing their overt facilities doesn't solve your mystery covert facilities problem. In fact, it probably just drives them to develop a weapon in those covert facilities. And they're like, right. Okay, and then they move on to something better. All right? So that's where we are at the moment, which is that Iran is making a lot of troubling progress, but there's no evidence that they've made the final decision to go for a nuclear weapon yet. They may never make that decision, but at the very least, they're not likely to do so in the near term because they get caught. And they don't want to get caught because they get attacked. Why do we care? Why do we care if Iran develops a nuclear weapon? I mean, there's the legalistic argument, which is they promised not to. Right? They're a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the argument that you sometimes hear of how is it fair that the United States has nuclear weapons and Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons is not, it's an inequality that's built into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The nuclear halves promised to do certain things to include reducing their arsenals over time. So the United States and Russia, for example, about a year and a half ago, agreed to a substantial reduction in strategic arsenals of nuclear weapons, for example. But so that the existing nuclear powers have to commit to long-term disarmament, and existing nuclear powers have to commit to providing other countries that want to generate peaceful nuclear energy with nuclear technology for that purpose. All right? But in exchange, the countries that didn't have nuclear weapons when they joined the NPT can't develop them. All right, so one of the reasons why we should care is that they're a member of the NPT and they promised not to do it. Right? And if as a signature of the NPT they manage to get away with it, it could have significant problems. We'll talk about that in a second. The most common arguments that you hear, however, are that the Iranians are crazy. The Iranians are crazy, and if they develop nuclear weapons, they'll use them. And in particular, they'll use them against Israel. After all, this is a radical ideological regime that regularly threatens to wipe Israel off the map, regularly describes Israel as a cancer that needs to be cut out of the Middle East. Right? It's currently, that's President Ahmadinejad up there on the right, regularly holding conferences denouncing Zionism and denying the Holocaust. Right? So if you're sitting in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, one could excuse you for thinking that this is 1936 and that Ahmadinejad is Hitler. I don't believe that. And I actually think most analysts of Iranian politics think that basically the abhorrent rhetoric that comes out of the regime is largely intended for some mix of domestic and international purposes. It's to use the fact that there's a lot of anti-Israeli sentiment in the region to generate pro-Iranian sentiment. Right? It's the way in which Iran flexes its resistance credentials in the region, claiming to stand up for oppressed peoples in the Palestinian territories or in Lebanon or elsewhere. The other argument against this is that Well, the regime in Tehran is religiously fanatical in many respects, is profoundly ideological, and have supported martyrdom, suicide operations all over the region. There's actually no evidence that they themselves are suicidal, right? And in fact, it's difficult to conceive of a single objective the regime wants to include the continued survival of the regime, the continued survival of the revolution, the continued survival of the Persian civilization, continuing to have a country to rule over. It would be achieved by launching a nuclear war against a state that could massively retaliate with its own nuclear weapons, and whether that be the United States or Israel, which doesn't admit to having nuclear weapons, but is largely assumed to have in the hundreds. All right? So the mullahs and ayatollahs in Iran are dangerous and sometimes reckless, but there's actually not a lot of historical evidence that they are insane. Right? So they could probably be deterred. And for the same reason, they're unlikely to give a nuclear weapon to a terrorist organization to launch against Israel, because their fingerprints might be on it, and again, suffer massive retaliation. So does that mean we should be sanguine and not worry about Iran having nuclear weapons? I think the answer to that is probably no, even if you believe that them using nuclear weapons is a low probability. First of all, low probability is not no probability, and the consequences of use are pretty high. But more concretely, Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. They provide a lot of assistance to violent militant groups all across the region, whether that be Hezbollah in Lebanon, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, and other Palestinian resistance groups in Gaza, whether it be Shia militia groups that killed as many as 600 Americans during the war in Iraq and still operate in Iraq, groups like Hezbollah and Sabal Haq, or whether it be other groups that are operating in the region. And there's a lot of evidence that the Iranian regime calculates the degree to which they can support terrorism and militancy in the region based on how likely it is they think for other stronger actors to retaliate against them. Right? So they dial up and back their support for militancy based on the likelihood of retaliation. So the concern is that if Iran had a nuclear weapon, they would be able to use it as a shield to deter retaliation. And so they would feel freer to ratchet up their low-intensity conflict. And we actually have a lot of precedents for this, not only in Iran's behavior, but in the history of nuclear weapons. So for example, during the Cold War, right, the United States and the Soviet Union never fought World War III between the two of them. But they fought proxy conflicts all over the world that killed millions of people. And in fact, Cold War scholars used to refer to this phenomenon as the stability-instability paradox, that the stability created by mutually assured destruction at the strategic level actually freed up the superpowers to be very violent to each other indirectly at lower levels. So we saw that between the superpowers during the Cold War. We've also seen it in South Asia between India and Pakistan, where Pakistan's development of a nuclear weapon correlates pretty closely with an uptick in their support for militancy, and to include militants that engaged in some pretty dramatic terrorist attacks inside the Indian homeland itself, and almost brought the two countries into a nuclear war in 1999 during the Kargil crisis. All right? So there is a history of countries that get nuclear weapons feeling like they are protected from retaliation and therefore pushing the envelope at lower levels of violence. And the consequence of this in the Middle East is more instability, more possibility for crisis. And that's where you could really get in trouble. Because even if countries are rational and have no interest in starting a nuclear war, stuff can happen. Organizational mishaps can happen, miscalculations can happen. The United States and the Soviet Union never fought World War III, but they came this close during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a lot of historians basically believe that it was more luck than rationality that prevented a nuclear war. Now put that into a Middle East context, where you have countries that, we'll take the case in point, Israel and Iran, or us and Iran, the two nuclear dyads in which an escalation event could happen. No means of communication, histories of distrust, very different worldviews, and the possibility of misunderstanding, miscommunication, miscalculation go very, very high. There's also a chance that a crisis, especially between Israel and Iran, could produce rational incentives for either side to actually go first, and I'll give you an example. Even if it's true that Israel, has hundreds of nuclear weapons, which is alleged to have, they're a very small country. So Israeli leaders may feel like they cannot absorb even a couple of nuclear weapons. That, in fact, a couple of nuclear weapons might devastate their command and control of their own nuclear arsenal to the degree that they wouldn't be able to retaliate. In other words, an adversary like Iran with even a handful of nuclear weapons might be able to carry out a first strike. On the Iranian side of the equation, initially they'll only have a handful of nuclear weapons, and so they'll fear that a country that's confronting them, whether it be Israel or the United States, that has many nuclear weapons, might be able to decapitate their capabilities early in a crisis. When you have two countries in the middle of a crisis that both fear that the other side is going to strike first, it creates their own incentives to be the first to do it themselves. All right? So, am I saying this is going to happen? No, my sense is that 999 times out of 1,000 it won't happen. But the one time it does happen, it could be a nuclear war. Right? There are also concerns that Iran would increase its coercive diplomacy, its support for subversion, undermine U.S. allies in the Gulf, undermine our freedom of action in the Strait of Hormuz. There are a whole host of reasons why an emboldened Iran would be bad news from a U.S. national security perspective. And the last argument that people make is that Iran is seen as an incredibly threatening actor, not just by the Israelis, but by most of the Arab states in the region, in particular in the Gulf, and that as a consequence of Iran developing nuclear weapons, countries like Saudi Arabia, other countries perhaps, Egypt or Turkey, might come under their own pressures to develop nuclear weapons. And then if you have a region with multiple nuclear powers, it just increases the possibility that something could go wrong. All right? Those are the arguments. I actually think most of those arguments, if you had to assess them, are at a relatively low probability, except for the emboldened use of militancy and terrorism, which I think is a pretty high probability, at least for some period of time. But low probability, high impact scenarios are something that we have to take very seriously. All right. And the Israelis take it very, very seriously. The consensus view among Israeli leaders is that Iran's nuclear program represents an existential threat to the state of Israel. Right? Agree with it, disagree with it. Right. I personally don't believe that it represents an existential threat to the state of Israel. I think that Israel is capable of deterring Iran under most scenarios. But I can also understand, as someone who's traveled to Israel 14 times in the last 3.5 years, I can also understand at a deeply psychological level, if I was living there, why I might feel the same way. Right? Especially when you layer on top of things Israel's particular history of the Jewish people. So there are things that the Israelis and the Americans agree on as it relates to the nuclear program, and there are things that they don't. What we agree on is that we have no difference in our assessment of the intelligence. Okay, we see the same things that they see, we see the same degree of progress that they see, we see. We don't have a disagreement about how close or not close they are to a nuclear weapon. All right? We also don't have a disagreement about whether we should care. While it may be an existential threat to the Israelis, administrations of both parties, Clinton, Bush, now Obama, have said that a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran is unacceptable, and have said that if they cross the nuclear threshold, it would be a threat to the vital interests of the United States. Right? That's where we agree. Where we don't agree is there still is a gap between an existential threat and a threat to the vital interests of a country, right? So the Israelis do perceive the threat more acutely than the United States does, because we're a continental-sized country of 300 million people, a long ways away from Iran. They don't have intercontinental ballistic missiles. They can't reach out and touch us yet. All right? The second thing, and I think this is underappreciated, is, and actually quite important, is that the Israelis, despite being by far the most powerful conventional military actor in the Middle East, only have a fraction of the military capabilities of the United States. Why does that matter? It matters because they can do less damage to the Iranian program, and they can't wait as long. Because the more developed the Iranian program gets, the more redundant, the more dispersed, the more deeply underground it's buried, the harder it will be for them to destroy it. And at a certain point, they might not be able to knock it back with their military capabilities. And wherever that point is, what they call the zone of immunity, ours is over here. Because we have much bigger bombs, and we have the ability to do this over and over and over and over again, not just in one night. All right? So they see the threat more acutely, and they don't have the same military capabilities, so they can't wait as long. All right? So a number of concerns that are driving Israeli calculations at the moment. Are the Iranians approaching the so-called zone of immunity. And here, the Israelis are particularly concerned about activities at Fordo. Because it's so deeply buried, the Israelis have said they don't have the ability to destroy it with airstrikes. In fact, that's why the Iranians built it that way. Not idiots. So they're concerned that the Iranians will soon enter a zone of immunity where a substantial portion of their program will be out of reach of the Israeli military. The second thing they're concerned is what Bibi Netanyahu talked about a week and a half ago, about once they accrue enough 20% to enrich up to 90%, that's a red line because they could shrink their dash time to nuclear material to 30 days, which the Israelis think is too close of a call. Right? There's also an Arab Spring dynamic, and here you have to think about this. It's a little odd, but if you were an Israeli trying to game out what the downside risk of attacking Iran would be, the number one concern that you would have would be that the Iranians would get their allies in your neighborhood to massively retaliate against you. And in fact, the Israelis are much more concerned about the 50 to 60,000 rockets and missiles that Hezbollah has in Lebanon than they are about Iran's ballistic missiles. Right? Why does any of this matter? Because Hezbollah gets resupplied through Syria. And things in Syria, the regime in Syria is extraordinarily distracted at the moment. So if you were going to pick a moment to strike Iran where it would be most difficult for Hezbollah to contemplate entering the war massively against you because they have to be concerned about being able to get resupplied during the war, now is the time. Now is the time. So there's an opportune moment for that. Obviously, the Israelis question whether the United States is willing to engage in military action ourselves. This isn't a matter of statement or policy. President Obama has said that nuclear weapons are unacceptable. He said that all options are on the table. He says he'll use all instruments to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. It's not a question of a particular president or a particular set of words. It's whether the Israelis are capable of the leap of faith involved in subcontracting out to somebody else taking on an existential threat. Remember I said that wherever their line is, our line is probably over here. Well, that gap is the leap of faith. Once they pass over their line, they basically have to trust that the Americans or somebody else will do it. Right? So the question is, do they trust that the Americans will do it? And lastly, they are factoring in whether, if they did it, it would be viewed as internationally legitimate. And they're not in such a good position at the moment because the consensus in the international community is that there's still time for diplomacy and sanctions to work. All right. So these are the factors, all right, that are factoring into the Israeli calculation about whether they take military action. I think that if you had asked me 2 months ago how likely it was they were going to strike before the U.S. election, I would have said actually it was about 50-50. Then some things happened, and the Israelis have made a decision to push this line off until the spring. That's when Netanyahu said 6 to 8 months. So I think for the moment, the possibility of a strike before the election is very low, but once we get into February and March, expect the war drums to start beating again. So what would happen if they did this? All right? You can kind of think about the Iranian reaction in 3 different categories. The first would be their direct retaliation. If Israel launches a massive airstrike against Iran's nuclear facilities, Iran would have to respond in some way overtly. They've threatened to do it for years and years and years. If they didn't, it would destroy their deterrent. So to reestablish their deterrent, they have to prove that when they threatened to retaliate against Israel, they meant it, which means that they will launch dozens of ballistic missiles against Israeli cities. Right? Probably Tel Aviv, probably the nuclear facility in Dimona. Right? They will do that at the very least. There's a possibility that there is the inevitability that they will blame the United States for an Israeli attack. There's the possibility that they will do an overt conventional retaliation against the United States. Possibility, but not a probability. The reason being that the Iranians aren't dumb, and they don't want to pick a fight with the U.S. military if they don't have to, because they realize that the United States military can do a lot more damage to them than the Israeli military. All right? So whether they take an all-out conventional attack, especially in the Strait of Hormuz, I think is possible but not likely, but I'll get back to this in a second. The Iranians will also retaliate against Israel and the United States indirectly. They'll retaliate through their proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I personally think the Palestinian groups are less likely to actually carry through that retaliation this time around than Hezbollah is, and Hezbollah itself will be nervous for the reasons we talked about a minute ago. I do think while the Iranians will be nervous about directly confronting the United States conventionally, they won't be nervous at all about confronting us asymmetrically. Why? Because they do it already. So I would expect that hundreds of rockets will be aimed at our embassy in Baghdad, our consulate in Basra, from Shia militant groups inside Iraq. I imagine that the Iranians will significantly dial up the kinds of lethal assistance they provide to the Taliban and other groups fighting American forces in Afghanistan, and NATO forces too. I think you could expect that there would be some terrorist attacks against critical infrastructure in the Gulf. Critical infrastructure meaning energy infrastructure. Again, terrorist attacks, not missile strikes. There could be terrorist attacks against U.S. targets abroad, and potentially terrorist attacks in the U.S. homeland. Although I think, again, the probability of these things are relatively low because they risk a much higher chance of escalation with the Americans, something that the Iranians would like to avoid if they could. The regional and global effects, I'm not sure why the formatting is off there, but it might be a Mac PC thing. For sure, the price of oil will spike up in the near term, $20, $30 a barrel. The market will simply factor in a security premium, right? The prospect that the war will disrupt the trade of oil, especially in the Gulf, right? They won't be so concerned about Iranian oil coming off the market because a huge chunk of Iranian oil has already been taken off the market by sanctions. It's more that the war could escalate in the Gulf, which would take a lot of the world's oil off the market, and it's an anticipation of that possibility that prices will go up, even if it doesn't happen. Now, whether they stay up or not depends largely on whether the conflict calms down after a couple of weeks or whether it escalates. All right? There could be very negative consequences on the Arab street. If you think about the chaos that was created by this asinine YouTube video that defamed the Prophet Muhammad, imagine the ability of extremists in this part of the world to take advantage of an Israeli strike on Iran. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of the extremists we're talking about are Sunni Arab extremists who are not in love with Iran. But that doesn't matter. It's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to frame, yet another Christian Zionist attack on the Muslim world, and to capitalize on that to create all sorts of trouble. There's also the risk that this could actually provide a lifeline to Iran, which is very interesting. Iran's soft power in the region, its influence, how popular they are in the region, has taken a huge hit in the last year and a half as a consequence of the Arab Spring. Because the Arab Spring is an Arab nationalist movement, and the Iranians have been perceived as meddling in a lot of Arab countries. And so if you look at opinion polls, the positive views of Iran have gone into free fall in the last year and a half. This might actually allow Iran to play itself as the victim of aggression, and by retaliating against Israel and maybe the United States to reestablish their credentials as the champion of resistance in the region. So ironically, while the strike itself might undermine elements of their military power, it might provide them an opportunity to enhance their soft power. Now, these other things, the sustained oil price spike, a regional war in the Levant, that just means an expansion of the war into Lebanon, principally. If Hezbollah retaliates and then the Israeli Defense Forces go massively into Lebanon, which is possible. Or if you start to get a war in the Gulf, whether countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates enter the conflict. And that's actually more likely than some people think, especially as it relates to the United Arab Emirates, who have a couple of disputed islands they'd like to take back from the Iranians. And they're the one Gulf state that wouldn't mind getting in half the flesh from the Iranian military if they could. Now, I've got this little probability slider here, right? The stuff at the top is all the highest probability. And in fact, there's a scenario in which only you have token retaliation, some proxy attacks, a short-term spike in the price of oil, some protests and demonstrations in the region, and then things just kind of calm down. That is completely conceivable. Is it likely to stop there? I don't know. But there's a line that Pentagon war planners use all the time, which is the enemy gets a vote. And another line they use is no plan survives first contact with the enemy, which is the same notion, right? And in this kind of context, there is so much more room for miscalculation and escalation than there is for rational, calm thinking and de-escalation. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's imagine that the Israelis strike Iran, and the Iranians make a threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, which they will make. Why? Because they've threatened to do it in the past. They've said, if anybody attacks us, we will close the Strait of Hormuz. So they will have to follow through with the threat to make another threat. All right? Now, I don't actually think they will try to do it, But they will probably have to make the threat. And the other reason to make the threat is that it would galvanize the world community to tell everybody to calm down, to de-escalate. Why? Because the Chinese and the Europeans and everybody else would freak out that if there was an actual war in the Strait of Hormuz, the price of oil would go through the roof. So not wanting that to happen, making the threat in the Strait of Hormuz is a way to galvanize diplomatic activity to calm things down. Right? So the Iranians have a big incentive to make a threat in the Strait of Hormuz, even if they don't have an incentive to take action in the Strait of Hormuz. Follow me so far? Now, the other thing the Iranians won't know when the Israelis hit them is, was this a one-off? Was this an only strike, or was this the first of many? Is it a prelude to a wider war? So they won't know what else is on the hit list. Will the Israelis and the Americans come after their ballistic missiles? Will the Israelis and the Americans go after their mines that are in storage depots? Will the Americans blow up their ports? Will the Americans blow up their integrated air defense network on the coast? Will the Americans blow up their anti-ship cruise missiles? They won't know. And if I'm them, I'm going to start to move that stuff. Why? Because we know where it is now. But once you disperse it, it's a lot harder to hit. So even if they have no intention of using it, they should move it. All right, now put yourself in the position of an American general in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. He's heard two things. They threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, and they're starting to move all the stuff that would be required to actually close the Strait of Hormuz. Coastal anti-ship missiles, all these mines out of storage, putting their mini submarines out to sea, putting their fast attack craft out to sea, turning on their integrated air defense network along the coast. So we will have no idea whether they are just bluffing or whether they intend to follow through the threat. And it's worse than that. If we don't take military action to blow this stuff up before it gets dispersed, it suddenly becomes extraordinarily threatening to U.S. ships and to international shipping. So there will be a huge incentive for us to preemptively strike those assets before they disperse too much. So again, it's another scenario in which you could get escalation even though nobody really wants it, but because a certain logic of escalation starts to take hold. Here's another example. The Iranian missiles, ballistic missiles, are terrible. But how many of you have ever been to Tel Aviv? All right. Have you ever been to the Kiryat, which is their equivalent of the Pentagon? Yeah. How close is it to a shopping mall? Yeah. 100 meters? Less? 3 dozen ballistic missiles launched into downtown Tel Aviv are going to hit something. All right? And even if they don't kill a lot of people, images on U.S. television stations of big gaping holes and screaming people in Tel Aviv will create its own domestic political logic for escalation. And if you don't believe me, you should come visit Washington, D.C. someday. Okay? What if Iranian-backed Shia militants in Iraq pull off a devastating attack against our embassy in Baghdad and kill several dozen American diplomats? It used to be back in the day when we had 50,000 troops there and a bunch of special operations forces, we could go after those groups when they did this stuff, which they did all the time during the war. They're not there now. Which means the only way you can retaliate for the Iranians killing a bunch of American diplomats is to launch missiles into Iran and blow up training camps. Anyway, I'm not saying any of this stuff is going to happen. I'm saying you can, once you start thinking about how the war starts to unfold, it's a lot easier to imagine it getting out of hand than staying in control. Right? And I say this not to make a judgment that military action versus Iran may or may not be a good idea, but to say that we shouldn't pretend that this will be neat and clean over in a few hours and everything will calm down. If the lesson of Iraq taught us anything, it's you should never go into a war with a best case assessment of how it's going to end up and a worst case assessment of the threat. And that's what we could be talking about here. Now, what would the military action itself accomplish if the Israelis did it? U.S. defense officials have said the Israelis could knock the program back a couple of years, 1 to 3 years. All right? If the Americans did it, we could knock it back considerably more because we have larger munitions and we could do this over and over again. It wouldn't be a strike, it could be a campaign. All right? But nobody has asserted that this is a permanent solution to the Iranian nuclear program. All it does is buy you some time. Right? The only way to permanently resolve the nuclear program in Iran militarily would be to invade and occupy Iran, and nobody is talking about that because even the craziest of crazy neocon hawks in Washington, D.C. aren't that crazy. Iran is a country of 70 million people with the terrain of Afghanistan and the most advanced paramilitary forces in the world. Don't do it. Right? It makes no sense, and nobody's talking. So short of that, you're talking about knocking back the program a couple of years if it's an Israeli strike, somewhat longer if it's an American strike. Well, what else happens? Well, you probably give the excuse to the regime to actually build nuclear weapons. Why? Because one of the reasons to build nuclear weapons is to create a deterrent against getting attacked again, and now you will have provided all the hardliners who have been making this argument with proof that an attack could actually happen. Right? The second thing is, this regime is increasingly unpopular, but a strike will likely, at least for some period of time, rally the Iranian public around the regime. Another thing that would allow is it would probably justify, or the Iranians would use it to justify, stopping cooperation with the IAEA and moving out of the NPT. Because they will basically make the following argument. We were playing by the rules, and yet we still got attacked. How do I know that this is plausible? In the last couple of weeks, there have been some reports of apparent sabotage near Florida. I don't know if these reports are true. I actually don't know if they're true or not. But what's more interesting about the story is that the Iranians blamed the IAEA inspectors for being complicit with the sabotage and hinted that they might downgrade their cooperation with the IAEA. So if they're talking about downgrading the cooperation with the IAEA in response to events of sabotage that may or may not have happened, it didn't produce much damage if it did, imagine what will happen the day after a strike. And why does that matter? Because the minute they kick the inspectors out, we will lose visibility into the program that they will be hell-bent on rebuilding. Right? So I say all of this to suggest that military action should be nobody's first choice. It's an extraordinarily risky thing to do at an extraordinarily tumultuous time in the region, and the effects of military action are questionable, right? Especially Israeli military action. So, what has Obama been trying to do? Now, I should say, I try to be an objective analyst as a scholar, but I worked for the guy, so I'm not objective. Okay, so on this particular issue, and I was involved in some of these policy decisions, so again, I'm not objective. I say that I think we've done the right thing, but I'm not, a bystander to all this. So Obama came into office with an offer of engagement for the Iranians, and he's been accused a lot of being naive. How could you be so dumb to think that you could sit down with the Iranians and the Iranian regime and that they'd ever strike a deal? I will tell you, as a member of the team that did the Iran strategic review at the beginning of the administration, that the goal of engagement was always to test the hypothesis that the Iranians were pursuing a nuclear hedging capability because they feared regime change. They feared American hostility. And so if you could change the tone, you could stop talking about sanctions, stop talking about military action, and change the tone and say that you're willing to have a sustained conversation with them on a whole host of issues, not just their nuclear program, you could test the proposition that the Iranians are only doing this because they're scared of us. So let's stop scaring them. Right? But in those same documents, we said, if that fails, because the Iranians reject it, it has the added benefit of making it clear to the world that it's not our fault. That it's the Iranians standing in the way of diplomacy, not the Americans. And whether this is fair or not, that was the perception during the Bush administration, that it was the Americans that were the problem for diplomacy, not the Iranians. Right? So the idea was always to have a good faith offer of diplomacy, but if the Iranians turned it down, to pivot away from that towards putting pressure on them. And that's exactly what the Obama administration did, starting in the fall of 2009, escalating through the spring and summer, principally of 2010, through getting UN Security Council Resolution 1929, which are the toughest multilateral sanctions ever imposed on Iran, and are the hooks upon which almost every other sanction that's been taken since by our country and others have been hung on. While the Congress has passed a number of unilateral sanctions that the administration has worked with them on, a bunch of our international partners would not have been able to pass the sanctions or to comply with U.S. sanctions in the absence of this UN Security Council resolution. And that UN Security Council resolution would not have been possible without the offer of engagement. Right? So the current Obama policy is what they call the dual-track policy, which is putting pressure on Iran to try to drive them back to the negotiating table while still being open to a diplomatic deal. Okay? 2 tracks, pressure and diplomacy. While reserving all other options on the table should that fail, to include military action. Right? The president has been increasingly clear over time, look, this policy is prevention, it's not containment, he's not going to live with a nuclear Iran, he'll use all instruments of national power to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But he's also been clear that he doesn't think that we're at the moment of decision yet, that there's still time and space for diplomacy, and that really the $50,000 question is, how much time? How much space? my personal view, and this is where I'll conclude, is that where Bibi Netanyahu drew the line is not the right line. All right, 6 to 8 months from now, we're not going to be at a go. We, the United States, I don't think will be at a go, no-go point. But it's actually not all that hard to imagine 18 months from now us being in that position. Because of the degree of nuclear progress the Iranians could make in the interim, they could bring them so close that we might not detect them slipping across the line. Right? And so your decision has to be made somewhere to the right of that, right, if it's going to happen at all. So my sense is that the next 18 months or so is a very crucial time. We're either going to get a substantial increase in diplomacy, and I think no matter who wins the presidential election, you're going to have to see an uptick in diplomacy with Iran on the back end of our election. So you're either going to get a substantial increase in diplomacy, hopefully culminating in some deal, whether it be an interim deal or a larger deal, or you're going to get a decision that I think is highly unlikely by Israel and the United States to simply acquiesce and accept a capability that the Iranians have, or you're going to get a conflict. And I don't know which one of those. I know which ones I prefer. I prefer a diplomatic solution. I think we all would. But I don't know. I can't. It's hard to judge at the moment which of them is most likely. So with that, why don't I open it up for some questions? Sir.
Hey, thank you very much for a very good discussion. You mentioned the word history one time in your talk, and expound on that for just a second. And would you acknowledge there's two lists in the world? One, the known characters who have the bomb, and those that are just, to coin a phrase, a screw turn away. Yeah. And if the names were revealed on that list, wouldn't we really be all very shocked? And to expound on that just a little bit more, if this dam breaks, we're going to have more people on that second list. And that would lead us to that famous quote by a Chinese general that said, is the U.S. willing to sacrifice Los Angeles to save Taiwan? So where this all leads, no matter if the best outcome occurs, it's all going to be very glum if proliferation is truly the bigger issue down the line.
So what you're talking about is really that there are a whole series of countries that are basically here. Okay, that they have a threshold or a virtual capability in which, screw turn is probably a little, hyperbolic, but I'm not, it's a common phrase. In reality, what it means is that they're weeks or a handful of months away from developing an arsenal. And countries that frequently are on that list are countries like Japan. Are examples of countries like that. A big concern is that if Iran crosses the nuclear threshold, or they're perceived to have crossed the nuclear threshold, it will undermine the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it will incentivize a whole host of countries in their region, especially countries that are threatened by that, principally Saudi Arabia, maybe Turkey, maybe Egypt, to pursue their own nuclear programs, and then you get what's called a nuclear cascade. Now, there's some good news in this. A nuclear cascade has actually never happened. It took about 20 years for the first 5 nuclear powers to emerge, and in the 40 years after that, right, we've only had 4 additional entrants into the nuclear club, and none of them sparked a massive arms race in their own region. So that's the good news. The bad news is just because it hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean it couldn't happen this time, and there are a couple of prime candidates, and Saudi Arabia is an interesting one. Most people think, they would do a crash program to build a weapon. That's not how the Saudis do anything. The Saudis would buy oil from Pakistan. Or they would work out an arrangement potentially for Pakistan to station nuclear weapons in the kingdom. But in any case, there are scenarios in which you could have an Iranian nuclear proliferation produce a handful of additional nuclear aspirants in the Middle East. And again, this is a place that's extraordinarily unstable and where wars happen all the time. And you throw nuclear weapons into the mix of that, and people get concerned. But I also personally believe we have to scrutinize all of these claims extraordinarily closely, because a lot of similar claims were made about Saddam Hussein's WMD programs in the lead up to the Iraq War that proved to be unfounded. All right, so and there were a lot of arguments about why Saddam himself could be deterred from using it, and why Saddam's acquisition even of nuclear weapons wouldn't be the end of the world. They were basically dismissed out of hand. So we did not have a very good and robust debate about these types of issues in the lead up to the Iraq War. And I'm cautiously optimistic that as a country we're not likely to make the same mistake on that front again, because we've had the Iraq experience and what a searing experience that was, and also because we're much further removed from 9/11, and it's almost impossible to understand the psychology of the United States and in going into Iraq without understanding that the kind of the temporary insanity that our country went through in the aftermath of 9/11. So I share the concern, which is that Iranian nuclear proliferation could trigger a bunch of efforts by other countries, which would be dangerous. But I think to some degree that concern may be a little exaggerated. In fact,
I appreciate you bringing up the small size of the Israeli state because of the Iranian attack. I was thinking, Iran is in a strange position in the region because they're like they're anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, fierce, anti-American stance, but their Arab Sunni neighbors in the region have also because they're Iranians, they're Shia, right? So let's hypothesize that Iran actually drops a bomb in Tel Aviv, Jaffa, or whatever. This bomb is going to have a nuclear fallout which is going to affect Arab Palestinians, Lebanese Shia in the south of Lebanon, Syrians across the Golan Heights. So they're going to target constituencies that are pro-Iranian, anti-Iranian, depends on, whatever the US, I guess. And
it's not a very good way to stand up for Palestinian rights to nuke a bunch of them.
yeah, I mean, Tel Aviv is like, I don't know.
No, I mean, this is actually one of the arguments that people make about even if you believe that the Iranian regime are religious zealots, that would be willing to run a huge risk of a nuclear confrontation in order to wipe Israel off the map. That in doing so, they would have to kill a lot of Arabs, especially Palestinians, and they would also put at risk Jerusalem, which is the third holy city in Islam. So there is, in a sense, a religious deterrent aspect that's involved here too, which is just another reason why I think a bolt out of the blue first strike by the Iranians to try to wipe Israel off the map with nuclear weapons is highly unlikely. Not no matter how you slice it.
And the Israelis, if I'm not mistaken, are in the process of arming submarines with nuclear weapons, which gives them even more deterrent capability if that works. But
So media reports suggest that they have submarines that already have Popeye cruise missiles that have nuclear warheads.
the main point I wanted to get at, though, is I see a real disproportion between the massive risk of high-intensity conflict, right, that comes from staking your reputation on a red line in a case like this, as against the possible likelihood of increased low-intensity conflict in the region if Iran had a weapon and was emboldened. That seems to me like a stupid bet to say we're gonna, light the torch and hope that this thing is contained in order to avoid a situation where maybe the Iranians might be a little more meddlesome.
Yeah.
And I just don't get that. And I don't understand why the Obama administration would feel compelled to do that when we know from, let's take the example of Vietnam, that once an administration has staked its reputation on a red line, right, they feel compelled to do it, basically for domestic political reasons. They can't back away from that without losing credibility. So why make that bet? I don't get it.
Yeah. I should say, most of the conflict, even in a strike scenario, most of the retaliation actually happens in the same low-intensity space. The high-intensity part of this, my belief, would be relatively sharp and short. And the reason is that, at least if the United States is involved, and this is not to be like chest-thumping optimistic, but there is no equivalency between Iranian conventional capabilities and American conventional capabilities. Whether it takes 10 days or 2 weeks, the entire Iranian Navy will be on the bottom of the ocean. Now, they might get their licks in. Right? This isn't going to be a cost-free thing for the American Navy. But, I mean, if the Americans do this, the United States decides to go to war and knock down Iran's conventional capabilities, they will destroy a huge portion of those capabilities in a very short amount of time. So what means is that the kind of high-intensity part of the war is not going to be as long. And by the way, the high-intensity part of the Iraq war wasn't particularly long. It was 3 weeks. Right? The low-intensity part of this war is the one that could linger for a long, long time. Iranian support for terrorism, Iranian support for subversion, Iranian proxy activities in the region. And so you're talking about whether, but so you're in both cases you're talking about the low-intensity side of things being, I think being most acute. The thing I would fear the most that is this piece, right? Which is, if you're worried about the global economy, a war in the Gulf could have very significant effects. I mean, putting the price of oil up to $200 a barrel and having it stay there for several months could be devastating to the European economy and by transit property, the American economy. Now, there are people who also argue that a nuclear Iran, which was able to create blackmail in the Strait of Hormuz, could also drive energy prices up, and you can have this debate back and forth. My own view is this. The cost of a nuclear Iran and the cost of military conflict are actually closer than some people think. Like I think a little closer to. I mean, I think you probably tip in the direction of military conflict clearly outweighing the cost of a nuclear Iran, or at least that's what the comments suggest. I think it's a fairly close call. And for me, a lot would depend on who did the war and under what context. And so, for example, there were 3 military actions taken against Iraq to undermine its WMD program. 1981, when the Israelis went after the Osirak facility. 1991, when the United States led this huge coalition into the Gulf War. And 2003, when the United States led a much smaller and less meaningful coalition into the war. Which was the war that stopped Iraq's WMD programs? The middle one. The 1991 conflict. Why? Because it had a lot of international legitimacy. We had a huge coalition coming into it, and more importantly, we had a huge coalition coming out of it. A coalition that was able to sustain no-fly zones, intrusive inspections, and a decade of sanctions, which prevented Iraq from rebuilding its program. So unless you can do the same thing in Iran, that is go into the conflict with a lot of international legitimacy and a big enough coalition to keep Iran isolated on the back end of that conflict, then I don't think the conflict's worth it. Because even if you could game out everything else, because they'll just rebuild the program. Right? So for me, a lot of it is even if you decided that military action was worth it, it would only be worth it in a very narrow set of circumstances.
Can I ask you a quick factual follow-up?
Yeah.
What's your sense of the consequences for Iranian civilians of a major U.S. strike?
I'm not going to be evasive. It completely depends on what targets you hit. Because if you're only hitting a handful of nuclear facilities, some people have suggested casualties in the hundreds, others have suggested much higher casualties. If you start bombing conventional facilities, so ballistic missile sites, ports, things like that, then obviously the risks go up. And if you go after production facilities for centrifuges, some of these are in Tehran, right? So it could easily be in the thousands.
Let's take one more question.
Earlier this year, General Benny Gantz
Who's the chief of staff of the Israeli Armed Forces.
And former Mossad chief Pentagon both went on record saying that Iran is rational, and yet we have this Netanyahu saying that they're not rational. Right? So how do we reconcile these diverging views?
What's interesting is that Netanyahu actually said both in his. Oh yes, I will. So the premise of the question was, in the last year, you had Benny Gantz, who's General Gantz is the chief of staff of the Israeli Armed Forces, so they're equivalent to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you had Mir Dagan, the former head of the Israeli spy agency Mossad, come out and say, hey, look, the Iranians aren't crazy, they're rational. They're dangerous, but they're rational. And the question was, so how do you reconcile that with Netanyahu's claims that the regime is messianic and irrational? And he made specific reference to this in his UN General Assembly speech. He actually made two contradictory arguments in that speech. On the one hand, he said that they're an apocalyptic cult that would welcome national martyrdom, and so, quoting Bernard Lewis, he said, the threat of assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an incentive. Right? Very provocative. On the other hand, he said, that's why we have to draw a red line, because it'll deter them from crossing the red line and make peace more likely. Which, of course, presumes that they're irrational and fear military strike, right? So, in that logic, they fear a conventional military strike if you cross a red line, but they don't fear nuclear annihilation in the event that they have nuclear weapons. It's an incoherent argument. All right? I think the red line argument was a little stronger than others. I think the reason why I think the Obama administration has been cautious about putting out a clear red line is that there's danger in that. If you put out a clear red line, it actually legitimizes Iranian behavior all the way up to that red line. So it can be very dangerous. And if you put the red line too far to the left, right, it won't be viewed as legitimate by the international community. You put it too far to the right, and it runs the risk of the Iranians move all the way up to the line and then slip across. So there's a lot of danger in putting a red line out there. In addition to the credibility arguments that you pointed out, there's a lot of dangers diplomatically in doing that as well.
Colin, this was just fabulous talk, very insightful. Let's thank Colin. We could spend the afternoon, but Colin has a car to catch. He's doing a twofer here today in our region. So thank you very much for coming.